So some of you may know Aesop's fable about the man and the lion walking through the forest arguing about who was the stronger. The man and the lion come to a clearing shown as a town square here in this beautiful 17th century woodcut by Francois Chavot. And they see a mural of a man pinning the lion to the ground. You see, the man says, "I am the stronger." You will see, the lion said, that this was not painted by a lion. And if it had been, the man would have been on the ground. So I want to focus not on the competitive nature of the conversation so much, but rather that such conversations between man and beasts were had in the old days. And more importantly, that all stories depend on their tellers. We are not separated from the rest of the animal kingdom. We are part of it. Jane Goodall reminded us recently. But we, the humans, have the voice. So I'm going to use 7 lenses to look at the city for the impact they can have on wildlife. The lenses are earth, habitat, diversity, migration, water, sound, and green corridors. We know that inviting nature and wildlife into our cities is good for our well-being and general health. We know that patient recovery rates improve, even if they can only see trees from their hospital windows, and that the NHS has begun to prescribe nature for people with anxiety and mental health issues. This is what the Japanese call Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. We know that we are also now more urban than rural and have experienced rapid growth and development like never before over the last 25 years. The Latin root of the word urban means refined and courteous, but we know that in urban areas there are only 8% of birds and 25% of plants compared to what would exist naturally in the wild. We know that species across the globe are in catastrophic decline, and that Germany has lost 70% of its insect population over the last 25 years. We know that pushing close to forests and other natural habitats is damaging in ways we are only beginning to understand collectively for the first time, which is leading to new ways of thinking about the role of cities, especially now as more and more people are raising their voices in climate action. As the world is in lockdown, our appreciation of where we live is shifting. In The Pandemic is a Portal by Arundhati Roy, writing from Mumbai, she says, "Who can think of kissing a stranger or jumping onto a bus without feeling real fear? Who can think of ordinary pleasure and not assess the risk? And even while the virus proliferates, who could not be thrilled by the swell of birdsong in the cities, peacocks dancing at the traffic crossings, and the silence of the skies?" Most birds that live in London are native woodland birds, living in our parks and gardens: thrushes, robins, wrens, finches, and jays. Most would naturally build their nests in the forks of tree branches or in hollowed out dead trees, using the abandoned nest holes made by woodpeckers, who only use them once. In the summertime, as just happened in the UK, swifts explode into our skies from Africa, beautifully captured here by Vincent van Gogh. You can almost hear them shrieking and barreling. On the Thames estuary, redshanks and oyster catchers rely on salt marshes and the mussel and oyster beds, along with thousands of other species who overwinter there. In our cities, dry, craggy conditions are very similar to mountainside, where it's hard for things to grow, but they grow nonetheless, and tiny pools of water suddenly appear caught for drinking and bathing when it rains. Urban pigeons, descended from wild rock doves, have taken advantage of this fact, just like the peregrine falcons nesting at Battersea in the Barbican and hunting from the Tate Modern's chimney. These brutalist structures actually replicate the rocky seacoasts of their natural habitat, offering clear sight of their prey, which is mostly pigeons, and safe places to rear their chicks. You may have seen the brilliant Archangel exhibition Natural Selection by the artist Andy Holden and his father, the ornithologist Peter Holden, at the former Newington Library in Southwark a few years back. We met Andy in a cafe near London Bridge 10 years ago. We'd been told about his lecture on birdsong and wanted to talk about the project we'd been commissioned to do for the AF. "What you really need," he said, "is to meet my dad." And so we were introduced to the man who inspired 1 million children when he became the national organizer of the RSPB's Young Ornithologists Club in 1975. Wildlife Explorers, as it is now known, has grown to 168,000 members, making it the largest wildlife club for children in the world. And together we began bird walks at dawn and at dusk, roaming the city to listen and look at its wildlife. We found that whilst many of the parks looked lush and green, the opportunities for nesting were in fact quite limited. This square was filled with house sparrows, which are on the red list in the UK, and yet it appeared rather meagre. But a derelict lot behind it had a huge hedge of flowering and fruiting ivy. Red Cross Gardens, established by Octavia Hill, would appear to be an urban oasis, but the planting is mostly not indigenous to the area, and so we found very few bird species here, compared with the seemingly barren brickwork of this terrace that was teeming with nesting sparrows in the nooks and crannies behind the rainwater goods. We found richness hidden in plain sight in the overgrown garages of the Provost's house outside the Tate that have become a refuge from the crowds along the embankment. And on one of our early morning walks, a pigeon dinner discarded just the breastbone and the wings remaining. This is a peregrine's favourite food. Alongside our walks, we researched nest box materials, designs, and locations to create 3 nestworks for the project. We worked with neighbourhood community groups, with Boston Better Bankside, and volunteers to create programmes celebrating the birds of Bankside. We gave public walks, and Andy and Peter created a new lecture on nesting that I was proud to learn this week had been included, the poster and the research files have been included in the Tate as part of their collection. There is now also a book made as part of Natural Selection available, which includes a fascinating history on nest building. And the nestworks that for the local area were a woodcrete block retrofitted from the blocks used to build the shard, hollowed out tree boughs mimicking those made by woodpeckers to make up for the lack of wood in the urban forest, and dense burying bushes to provide attractive nesting opportunities for local birds, and also winter food, an important aspect which is often overlooked. They're also a safe place to roost at night. So this was how we began our journey into architecture for other species. So let's consider the 7 lenses. The first lens is the Earth. 51 years ago, astronaut Bill Anders took this photograph of Earthrise from Apollo 8. It's one of the most famous and prized assets on the Wikimedia Commons. And it followed on from Stuart Brown's cover photo for the Whole Earth catalogue, which he'd lobbied NASA for a few years back, for which he thought would be a fitting symbol to evoke a sense of shared destiny and adaptive strategies. In 1991, Shell Oil produced a powerful film highlighting the dangers of climate change, asking how we would agree a global target in a world of nation states where 1 billion were intent on maintaining their high standard of living and 4 billion more were intent on catching up. Today, we are closer to 8 billion, as this Gapminder data shows, with the rise in life expectancy and income over the last 30 years. And as we saw in those first 2 images, Earth is finite. This is the central tenet of Kate Raworth's donut economics. The energy from the sun and the fertility of our soil supports life on Earth for all species. The soil is just a very thin layer, but is teeming with both life, both organic and inorganic, that supports plants to provide food, fiber, fuel, and cleans and filters the excess water to recharge the underground stocks. And most importantly, soil is the ultimate digestive system, decomposing all that lived and recycling it to enable new life. Earth is, however, often not seen and covered in our cities. The second lens is habitat, which is where individual species can find food, shelter, protection, and mates. A habitat is not necessarily a geographical area or place. It can be inside a stem, a rotten log, a rock, or a clump of moss. Habitats are also part of the commons, which are the cultural and natural resources accessible to society. The commons include materials such as air, water, and a habitable earth. They can be understood as resources that communities manage for individual and collective benefit. For example, a beaver manages the waterways by building dams to slow and filter the water, which also provide habitats for fish, invertebrates, amphibians, and water birds. Fungi manage the decomposition of trees to nourish the soil. Wolves manage the deer population to prevent overgrazing. So it's helpful to think about the commons not just as a resource, but also as an active verb, something we all do, something we all can do. You may have heard of the tragedy of the commons and of Elinor Ostrom, who won the 2009 Nobel Prize in Economic Science for her groundbreaking research, demonstrating that ordinary people are indeed capable of creating rules and institutions that allow for the sustainable and equitable management of shared resources. As Noam Chomsky points out, it is in fact privatization which is destroying the commons, specifically through environmental catastrophe. And in urban areas, public spaces are our commons. And though it's harder to introduce and protect habitats in such densely used spaces, that should not stop us from trying. In France, all new buildings are now required to have green roofs, offering nesting opportunities for birds and habitats for insects. In Berlin, beavers are now a protected species found in almost all the waters of the Havel and the Spree. In Amsterdam, WaterNet is using soft policy instruments encouraging, informing, and activating residents, businesses, and local government officials to work on the designs of roofs, streets, gardens, parks, and squares that can better handle intensive rainfall. In these dense urban places, trees and plants provide welcome urban cooling, scrub pollutants out of the air, and cut down the carbon. So Nestworks taught us also how to look at scruffiness differently. We began to appreciate that those brambles, scrambling Russian vines, and mature flowering ivies provide valuable habitat for a host of wildlife and shelter from magpies, who cannot search out sparrow eggs in such a tangled mess. Because magpies, along with other urban species such as gulls, crows, and parakeets, thrive on the readily available food and the urban heat island effect. Individual trees, evenly spaced, are to magpies the equivalent of fly-through McDonald's, offering easy access to nests for smaller birds, which leads to the decline of those woodland birds that have made their homes in our cities. After Nestworks, we won a competition to provide support for urban birds, bats, and bees, which we developed into a range, if I can make this work, of flat pack nest boxes called Habi Sabi. The name celebrates and twins urban habitat with the Japanese concept of wabi sabi, the appreciation of nature as imperfect and essential. The boxes are all made from material recycled from waste insulation, from buildings and fridges like these that would otherwise end up in landfill. Fibers from car body give them the strength, and importantly for wildlife, there's no off-gassing from adding glue. They're very lightweight, they're rot and warp-proof, and 100% compliant with RSPB guidelines. And they're available online. Green walls have become very fashionable. This one at the Caixa Forum in Madrid, for example, is extremely beautiful and adds thermal stability to the building it's on. But they rely on mechanical pumps and parts, and so they're high maintenance. And if not maintained, the resulting collapse is rapid and catastrophic. There are other ways to create green walls. This project by Gustafsson Porter Bowman at Stratford will be one of the longest living green walls in Europe when it matures, growing up a new retaining wall along the railway lines. Worth noting the edge condition here on the margins of infrastructure, water utilities and the River Lee. Just out of shot, there are herons nesting in those spaces. And if the photo was taken at night, we would see bats too. Native plants planted at the base of the wall will provide new habitat, and 50 flat pack Habi-Sabi nest boxes will offer attractive opportunities for local and migratory breeding birds. Already, the ivies and vines growing up are providing further shelter for insects and wildlife. Insects, of course, vital for pollination, as we all know, but also as food for many other species. A blue-tip brood, for example, needs 1,000 caterpillars a day to thrive. Now let's look through the lens of diversity, because vitality and diversity are often counted as, and are really important urban qualities, especially so in London. But what if we consider our animal neighbours as part of that urban diversity? We don't have any keystone species in London, though beavers have been released into the wild recently and will eventually find their way through the waterways. But we do have 10,000 urban foxes and a host of others operating, often below the radar. Just as Piccadilly Circus and Trafalgar Square have layers and layers of users, from marchers to buses to taxis and pedestrian shoppers, so does Regent's Park, from Frieze Art Fair, which sets up Frieze London and Frieze Masters on 40,000 square metres in October each year, to a permanent open-air theatre, a rose garden, tennis courts, the zoo, biking, blading, jogging, and then, of course, there is wildlife. Regent's Park has the only breeding population of hedgehogs in London, but recently they were found to be in decline. A local volunteering group tracked and mapped their nocturnal journeys to understand how they occupied the territory. Each colour is a different individual hog on a different successive nights. Aside from Frieze landing flat-footed on their breeding and foraging territory every autumn, in green and white here on the left, the problem the hogs have is that some parts of the park have been fenced in, and this is stopping them from breeding. London Zoo approached us to work with the Royal Parks and the volunteering group to develop hibernation boxes and 30 gateways to allow short-bodied hedgehogs to scamper through, but stop longer-bodied animals like foxes or dogs. They were extremely simple, made in marine ply with their feet dipped in acrylic to stop moisture wicking up from the damp earth. And much to our delight, they were used straight away. Here is a nighttime camera shot a few weeks after they were installed, showing a hedgehog disappearing into the bushes. You can just see it on the top left of the box there. But a growing question in our mind is what the algorithmic responsibility should be when geolocating mythical animals, like these Pokemon, in sites of real zoological interest, like Regent's Park. And how does this impact wildlife diversity? Hedgehogs, we know, hibernate, but what about species that migrate? Just as the ebbs and flows of the River Thames remind us of the circadian rhythms of the moon, and the water levels of our rivers change with the season, so too our city floods with visitors in the summer months, some of whom, like tiny swifts, beautifully captured here by wildlife artist Jonathan Pomeroy, fly non-stop 11,000 kilometers from Africa to nest in Europe, the only time in their lives that they land. Everything else, even sleeping and sex, they do on the wing. But unfortunately, as our buildings get smarter and more energy efficient, we seal them up more tightly to avoid losing heat through their fabric. Traditionally, we shared our buildings and our homes, our barns, with swifts, bats, and owls. But today, we have created a homeless migrant animal population. Already struggling with habitat loss and climate change, swifts arrive to find their nest places sealed up or gone. To help mitigate and draw attention to this problem, we were commissioned to create a swift and bat refuge by Edward Mayer, the president of Swift Conservation, with research support from the RSPB. We worked with Hutchinson Engineers, a leading mobile phone mast manufacturer, to subvert its design and create a piece of standalone infrastructure, easy to install with a single HIAB. The interior has 8 nesting compartments made from marine ply, and at the base there are rough oak boards for bats to climb up easily to roost. On the left here, the column is part of a family of utilities set into the new Green Heart University in Birmingham. On the right, in Woking, it is at the entrance of the Borough Council offices and directly opposite the World Wildlife Fund by Hopkins Architects. It's a town twinning sign celebrating shared connections and open borders with Le Plessis-Robinson in France and Rastatt in Germany. At its base is a stone plinth with a public map describing the flight path of the swifts, shared with us by the British Trust for Ornithology. The garden is a space for teaching children about migration and wildlife in the city. A balance between public safety and keeping bats happy has been to include a soft downwards light facing gently onto the carved stone in place of the harsh, bright street light that was already there. Because wildlife is challenged by the 24-hour city. Many people think that just as we sleep at night, our animal neighbours do the same. But in fact, as anyone who has a cat will know, the biological activity of many other species is much more intense at night than during the day, and they need the night for their normal activities. Approximately half of all wildlife are crepuscular species that begin their daily activities at sundown, and artificial lights at night constrain this. Many birds migrate at night. They use the stars to navigate. This behavior naturally draws them to the bright lights in the urban centres along their journey, which they can see several hundred kilometres away, meaning they normally have one in sight. In these unfamiliar urban environments, night migrating birds often fatally collide with tall buildings. Artificial light is especially confusing to birds on foggy and rainy nights when they fly at lower altitudes. Colliding with buildings is a leading cause of death, second only to habitat loss. A recent study estimates that between 100 million and 1 billion birds are killed in the United States each year as a result of collision with buildings. Safe Wings Ottawa has been publicly displaying the dead birds collected by volunteer patrollers since 2013 to try to visualize these numbers. And now many cities across the world are enacting lights out programs, turning out unnecessary lights from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. every night, especially during the peak migration season, which is March to May and August to October. What would the wildlife in the city look like through the lens of water? Because urban communities tend to be less water-wise than rural communities, we often cannot see the impact of road and other pollution on the fish of our rivers and fail to recognize that wildlife need clean drinking water too. Bromine is widely used in fountains as a disinfectant, but unfortunately this makes the water undrinkable. Rills and water features without jets are more likely not to require this treatment and so much more suitable for wildlife than fountains with jets. You may remember that this was an important aspect of Catherine Gustafson and Neil Porter's winning design for the Diana Memorial Fountain in Hyde Park, where they used natural borehole water with UV filters and sand traps instead. London has seen rain gardens becoming a common feature over the last half decade too. Effectively, the rain garden slows and filters water runoff from roads, leaching out pollutants as it does so, which means that our storm drains and rivers are better able to cope with heavy rainfall, increasing now with so much extra energy in the atmosphere. London can be proud of its improvements in water quality in the Thames, which has seen seals and porpoises in the centre of the city. There are opportunities for sensitive and intelligently designed new public spaces along the riverside, in which our animal neighbours could be offered an opportunity to thrive. Let's look with our ears now and consider sound as a lens. Public spaces can be noisy spaces. Hard surfaces amplify this traffic, and even pedestrian crossings can feel unnecessarily harsh. I often wonder why we don't play with sound in the city more, like the fantastic musical crossing at Harvard, for example. But what about wildlife and sound? Hans Slapperkorn of Leiden University in the Netherlands conducted a study on great tits living in 10 European cities and 10 nearby forests. And apologies, this is a robin, but he serves my purpose. Slapperkorn analysed the way that blue tits used song to attract mates and establish territorial boundaries. City birds adapt to life by singing faster, shorter, higher-pitched songs. The forest birds sing slow and they sing low. Great tits living in noisy cities have to compete with the low-frequency sounds of heavy traffic, which means their songs go up a pitch to make themselves heard. A bird that sang like Barry White in the forest sounds like Michael Jackson in the big city. The good news is that urban greening, such as trees, green roofs, and green walls, are good at softening the impact of traffic noise. Urban greening is a vital part of the UK's green infrastructure strategy and of London as a national park city. And if we thought outside the box a little, a tree for every car parking space, we would not only reduce the traffic on our roads, but also gift our children and their children with better, more vital, diverse, and healthy public spaces. The word lens comes from the Latin name of the lentil, because double convex lens is lentil shaped. And so fittingly, our final lens is a green corridor. It's useful to consider the report by the ecologists Jukka Jokamaki and Esteban Fernandez Irichek, who take a habitat island approach to bird conservation in urban landscapes. Their conceptual model for this includes management, environmental education, and research. Their test beds were an area of ancient forest in Lapland in northern Finland, subsequently fragmented by logging, which they compared with 25 urban parks in Madrid. So here we see the ancient forest in 1987 on the left, largely intact, just a few clearings here and there. And then 15 years later, the managed forestry has all but destroyed it in Lapland, but interestingly not if you look at the top right-hand border in Russia, which has a different management system. Ancient undisturbed forests, we know, protect water systems, encouraging the formation of healthy soil and breaking down ambient air pollution. We know that if forests are left to grow, they can provide vital mitigation for climate change globally. All our futures are entwined with the health of forests. And the sad thing about these forests is that a lot of what they produce are things like toilet paper. Meanwhile, in Madrid, we see a vertical list of parks on the left, and on the right, the bird species that might inhabit them. So the Chartreuse is 100% likelihood of occupancy, and the cadmium red is 0% chance. And at the bottom is the very smallest park, which only has a 50% chance of occupancy by even the most common bird. So we can see here that in this case, size also really does matter. And this is a project of ours from a long time ago in the 90s called Eco City, which we showed at the Venice Biennale, a sort of eco-utopia with what we called eco-causeways, cutting across continents to aid the migration of species to more suitable environments. A sort of new natural urban resource regenerating growth and affecting its pattern of development, which seemed futuristic then, but today there is an $87 million Liberty Canyon wildlife crossing by architect Clark Stevens being built 200 feet above a 10-lane highway just outside LA. It will be the world's largest animal overpass and the very first of its kind near a major city. And it's being built to widen the puma gene pool, especially that of Puma P22, who lives in Griffith Park, where he's almost as famous as Brad Pitt. This is another example of wildlife affected by roads, and an extremely costly one. The last project I'm going to show is a biodiversity project for Woking that, all being well, will start on site this autumn. We were invited to produce a conceptual landscape for a 1.5 kilometre median strip between 4 lanes of traffic which disrupted the connection between the town centre and the commons beyond, including the triple SSI Basingstoke Canal. We proposed a community of trees to reflect the borough's own diverse community, and worked with ecologists and landscapers to research the local wildflowers that grow on the roadside verges, that can deal with road salt, and the shrubs and trees that are good at dealing with pollution. We found that rainwater from the road was flowing straight into the canal, and proposed rainwaters to detain, cleanse, and filter the polluted runoff before it entered into the watercourse. Native species and charred boughs provide rich habitats for the insects and will be attractive to others, such as birds and toads and other amphibians too. But it's a very complicated space to work in. There are many conflicting policies on trees and how to avoid the spread of disease, and the ground itself has historically, as in many urban places, been prioritized for conduits and traffic rather than roots. And we're in favour of the Stockholm tree pit method, using structural soil of rocks, gravel and sand, rather than containing the root in plastic crates, as in the current climate crisis, I would venture, it seems counterintuitive. And in any event, the crates protect the cables rather than the trees. Maintenance is another tricky issue, because unlike the Japanese gardeners that I saw at Narita Airport in the 80s, with their split-toe tabby boots and their reverse-stroke pruning saws, many UK boroughs and councils outsource their maintenance to blokes with power tools. London even employs urban hoovers on the South Bank with names like the Guzzler. Municipal pruning techniques are rather more Minecraft or Lego than a thoughtful response to the individual growth patterns of trees. But we found a balance, working together with the full council team, from engineers, water, trees and maintenance, and skillfully led by Tracy Haskins of Green Infrastructure. The final design has naturalized groupings of trees and shrubs and a number of champion trees that will be allowed to reach their full and natural size. Centered crossing gardens will engage our senses in places we naturally pause, and more importantly, there will be but more habitats for wildlife. So wildlife-friendly urban design provides vital lifelines to city creatures to help them find food, shelter, protection, and mates, even at a small scale, like the hedgehog gateways in Regent's Park. I hope that some of these lenses have been useful in appreciating the importance of green corridors to allow wildlife to safely move around. So to finish, I want to show you a photo that was in the news around this time last year during the nesting season. There were trees netted by developers, some of you might remember them, to prevent birds from nesting. And whilst their mitigation report, of course, promised replacement trees, the point was that they were not acting as part of nature, but superior to it by covering them up in the time that the birds biologically were meant to reproduce. And the final slide is of the Snowdon aviary. designed by Cedric Price, Frank Newby, and Anthony Armstrong Jones. The gauge of the net, whether by design or chance, is just large enough for the smaller local birds like sparrows and finches to come and go as they please. And in this way, the net provides an enclosure that is both refined and courteous. And I would like to question whether these two words, refined and courteous, the root of the word urban, could act as guiding principles for us all to act as architects for other species. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you. That was fantastic. I was reminded, there's a book I'm sure you know, by R.S.R. Fitter, London's Natural History, which I thoroughly recommend if anyone doesn't know. It's from 1945, and I think very much looking at the city from the kind of perspective that Catherine was talking today. But one of the things that's remarkable about the book, of course, is that it's looking at the natural history of London at a time when the city has undergone very extraordinary set of circumstances. So we're looking at, Fitter's looking at the way that bomb sites have been colonized by different species, and the way that the river is being used at a time when there's much less industry on it as a result of the war effort. And one of the exciting things of the last few weeks, obviously, has been, one of the compensations, perhaps, has been this sense of a changing relationship between man and nature in the city that's been kind of made possible by the virus. And I guess we've been having these sort of daily news stories about goats reclaiming Landudno and elephants coming into cities in Sri Lanka. And we're also living through this kind of quite, I think, exceptional moment. Do you see signs for optimism about the way that we've all experienced this kind of changing relationship between nature and man over the last month?
I do, and I think it is like you say, one of the real upsides. And as the beautiful piece by Arundhati Roy, I think celebrated too. And I have had so many people reach out to say how they're noticing wildlife, urban wildlife in the city in ways that they never did before. And a lot of it does come down to sound and the fact that it's a lot quieter. People are actually getting woken by birdsong, which was why I chose the Messiaen piece for that reason. But that's not something that is usual in the city. And I think that there could be a real groundswell of people wanting to preserve and enhance those feelings and to bring more of it into our world.
We have some questions which have been promising. Audience members, I've allowed you to unmute yourself, so if I call you out, can you unmute yourself and pitch the question? So first, could we hear from Lucilla Sampioli? Hello. Lucilla, can you get here? Or I'm going to read it out if not. Okay, so Lucilla's question was, do you have any thoughts on the actual policy regulation over biodiversity? Do you think local authorities are taking it into account for new developments?
That's a very good question, and I know that I think local authorities are doing the best that they can, and a lot of new planning permissions require biodiverse measures, maybe not enough, but we could do something as architects as well, and judging panels, for example, could be looking at that as being a positive aspect that could be included. I think that often that there's a lot of it's hard to make a blanket policy. In a way, we need to also look quite locally to see what each local area might need. If you're close to a river, it will be different to, if you're close to woodland. And so, but I think certainly there's some tentative starts.
Okay. We were having difficulty unmuting. So, Will Jennings, I'm going to come to you. I'm going to unmute you, so don't do anything, and then see if we will. Oh, no. No. It's not liking that at all. Will, can you unmute? Ah, there we go. Will, can you pitch your question? No, not hearing from him. Okay, excellent talk. Thank you. I wonder if you have any observations on the current London National Park City proposal, which has got the support of the mayor and lots of businesses who see a chance of some good publicity. I have strong reservations, but any comment on it from a granular animal view vantage? Will's saying he doesn't have a mic. Sorry.
Yes, Will, that's you and I should have a coffee sometime. I think. I think that it goes to the granularity. I think is something that's very hard to bring in. I think I have reservations about the relationship between the 24-hour city for us and the impact on wildlife. And then there is also, I don't know in enough detail what sort of margins are being proposed between us and wildlife, but I think that is a really important aspect of how we distance ourselves. So just like social distancing at the moment, perhaps we should have some wildlife distancing.